four corners of the earth and the far corridors of history. Dateline, World War II. October 1942, Guadalcanal. Since repulsing the fierce Japanese attacks on Bloody Ridge in mid-September, life for the Marines here has fallen back into a daily routine of misery and boredom broken by moments of stark terror as Japanese bombers pound their positions. Stifling heat, torrential rain, and rampant disease make daily existence on the island nearly unbearable. The Marines are isolated and they know it. Sensing that the number of Japanese on the island is increasing, their morale plummets. After 2 months without relief, even the most gung-ho among them begin to doubt they will ever get off this steamy, malaria-ridden island. Increasingly, Henderson Field, the airfield that is both their reason for being on the island and their hope for salvation, has come under Japanese shelling. Without reliable air cover, the Marines are easy prey for the flights of Japanese bombers passing overhead. U.S. commanders decide that even though they are undermanned, an offensive is necessary to drive the enemy back from the Henderson Field perimeter. On 7 October, the 1st Marine Division attacks west out of the beachhead toward the mouth of the Mechanico River. For the Marines, even the horrendous fighting is a welcome change. After months of boredom and defensive warfare, they are finally taking the battle to the Japanese. In heavy fighting on the 8th and 9th, the Marines wipe out an entire Japanese battalion. With that taste of victory, the Marines are anxious to continue their attack, but incoming intelligence indicates that the Japanese are preparing an offensive of their own. Much to the Marines' dismay, they are withdrawn to their original defensive positions. Again, they wait. Meanwhile, bombers operating from Henderson Field begin to enjoy some success in destroying Japanese transports landing troops on the island. On 13 October, the Imperial Navy, fearing it is losing the upper hand, brings up the battleships Congo and Haruna to shell the airfield. The shelling continues through the 14th and destroys over 50 aircraft. The Japanese quickly take advantage of the interruption in American air cover and land 4,500 troops and large quantities of supplies west of the Marines' beachhead at Tessaferanga. While the Japanese are busy landing reinforcements for their upcoming offensive, the Marines are also getting some much-needed help. On the 13th, the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment lands on the island, boosting the U.S. contingent to 23,000. On 21 October, the long-awaited attack begins. The main thrust is made by the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division, which drives northward between the Lunga and Tanaru rivers toward the American beachhead. Secondary attacks are launched on the Marines' western flank across the Mechanico. Much like their attacks on Bloody Ridge in September, the Japanese plan is poorly conceived and executed. The commanders have little or no intelligence about the location and disposition of the U.S. forces. They are also attacking from inland, which makes reinforcing their troops extremely difficult. U.S. artillery plays a crucial role in blunting the Japanese attacks. Advancing formations are decimated before they can effectively engage American troops. Even as their casualties mount, rigid Japanese commanders refuse to alter their tactics. They send wave after wave into the killing fields in front of the American positions. Although they are undoubtedly getting the best of the Japanese, the Americans too are receiving heavy casualties. Japanese artillery and tank fire take their toll, as does the increasingly vicious hand-to-hand combat. By 27 October, after a full week of vicious fighting, the offensive peters out and Japanese commanders call off the attack. They have suffered 3,500 casualties, including many of their best officers. Although the Americans, too, are exhausted, the situation on Guadalcanal has now drastically changed. The Japanese, who have until now chosen when and where to fight, have lost the initiative. The Americans, having won a decisive victory, are now preparing to launch their own major offensive, one which, they hope, will give them control of the island. And that may change forever the momentum of the war in the Pacific. October 1942, for the second time in 2 months, outside the Egyptian town of El Alamein, the German and British armies face off against each other. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man used to getting his way, has for weeks been prodding Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to attack the Nazi Afrika Korps. Kibitzing by those not actually on the battlefield is a time-honored tradition, of course, and has, through history, created problems for frontline officers. Knowing that, Churchill accepts, in theory, the primacy of his battlefield commanders. Nonetheless, he sees in North Africa the opportunity to score an enormous victory, and he is impatient. Though Monty's hesitancy has frustrated Churchill, as he faces the Germans, the Field Marshal enjoys a tremendous advantage. He has insisted that he will not initiate a battle until his forces are numerically twice as strong as the defending Germans. Despite entreaties from above, Monty knows that time is on his side. Supplies and reinforcements flow freely to the British in North Africa, while the Nazis are having increasing trouble supplying the Afrika Korps. The Germans are also suffering from back-of-the-lines kibitzing of their own. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the extraordinarily skilled commander of the Afrika Korps, is in Europe for rest and rehabilitation. His defensive plans are being implemented from afar by General Georg Stumme. At 21:30 hours on 23 October, the German defenders hear the drone of British bombers passing high overhead, heading for targets deep behind the lines. 10 minutes later, Montgomery's 900 artillery pieces begin lobbing shells into the German forward positions. The Germans, having been lulled into complacency by Montgomery's hesitation and Rommel's departure, are taken by surprise. Stumme is almost instantly isolated from thousands of troops under his command, and within hours of the opening of the barrage, lies dead on the Saharan sands. The English press forward on a 6-mile front, braving entrenched Germans and unmapped minefields which take an enormous toll. By 24 October, Australians under Montgomery's command take Kidney Ridge, a line of high ground with a clear view of the German 15th Panzer Division. Rommel is ordered by his Führer to return to the battlefield, and upon his arrival in Africa on 25 October, sees that the situation is much more dire than he had been led to believe. If the Germans are to salvage anything from the battle, they need not only to hold the ground they still have, but also to recapture that which they have lost. Kidney Ridge, in particular, must be retaken. However, Rommel's troops have few tools to bring to bear on the British. Not only have German lines of communication largely been severed by the British artillery, but the Nazi tanks have almost no fuel with which to maneuver. They are left fighting an almost pure infantry battle, something for which they are outnumbered and ill-prepared. It is not long before the Australians, using Kidney Ridge as their starting point, punch a huge hole in German lines. On 31 October, Rommel notifies the Luftwaffe that they will soon be needed in an attack he himself will lead. He dispatches Stukas to pound the Australians on Kidney Ridge and drives the remnants of his 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions forward in a desperate counterattack. Incredibly, the attack works, plugging the hole in the German lines and allowing Rommel to momentarily consider an attack on Kidney Ridge itself. Montgomery finds himself looking less at victory than at the possibility of stalemate, exactly the outcome he feared as he rebuffed Churchill's entreaties to attack quickly. Dreading both an extension of the war in Africa and a long series of I-told-you-sos from London, Monty whips up Supercharge, an operation that will throw his armored reserves into action and hopefully break the backs of the Germans. The attack begins 2 November, with an artillery barrage that drops more than 15,000 high-explosive shells on a front barely a mile wide. Infantry pour into the breach, with armor not far behind. And in a matter of hours, 3 British tank divisions are wreaking havoc behind German lines. Rommel, sensing the opportunity to kill scores of British tanks while risking few of his own, trains his devastating 88mm guns on the British. In no time, burning armor litters the battlefield. It appears that the Germans might well be on the verge of victory when flights of British bombers begin to swoop down on the 88s, picking them off one by one. By sunset, enough artillery has been silenced that the British positions behind German lines are secure. 30,000 German troops are dead or captured, and 2/3 of Rommel's guns destroyed. The Desert Fox, resigned to the inevitable, orders his remaining troops to withdraw. Der Führer, dispensing orders from the comfort of the German capital, berates Rommel for his prudence in cutting his losses, demanding instead victory or death. Rommel, with the blessing of his commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, ignores the kibitzing from the rear and pulls his forces back 120 miles to Mersa-Matruh. Montgomery takes a moment to indulge in a little back-of-the-line supposition of his own, thinking out loud that perhaps he should dispatch someone to capture Rommel. That, like Hitler's order to win or die, is easier said from the rear than done on the lines. November 1942, North Africa. In the early morning hours, a group of U.S. Army Rangers comes ashore near the port of Arzew, some 30 miles to the west of Oran. These Rangers are the spearhead of a massive invasion by Allied forces. Some 100,000 men, most of them Americans, divided into 3 separate task forces, begin to move ashore in an area of operations that spans some 500 miles. This is Operation Torch, the first major assault by U.S. ground troops against the Axis. In charge of the endeavor is an American Lieutenant General, Dwight David Eisenhower. In taking on the task, Eisenhower was aware that it would require much more than the organization and execution of a military action. If the plan were to succeed fully, British and American soldiers, from the command staff down to the men on the front lines, must abandon their military and political differences and act as a team. Now, as his troops begin to move ashore, Dwight Eisenhower will be given a chance to see, as few men ever are, just how successful his labors have been. At Arzew, the rest of the 18,000 men of the Central Task Force begin to move ashore here and at Oran to the west. 3 regimental combat teams of the Army's 1st Division hit the beach and begin moving inland. Directly behind them, transports begin to unload some 180 tanks, which promptly join the battle. Thankfully for these men, Allied intelligence has been excellent, and the surprise is complete. Although there is some resistance, Axis troops in both cities soon run up the white flag. Contributing to the rapid surrender is the fact that these are not German soldiers. They are rather Vichy French, and while the government for which they bear arms is in cahoots with Hitler's Germany, many view the Germans as invaders of their homeland. While the troops here continue their push toward Oran, the men of the Eastern Task Force landing near Algiers find the going somewhat more difficult. While the task force is comprised primarily of British troops, the initial landing is made by the U.S. 34th Infantry Division. Eisenhower and his staff reason that the French may be more willing to surrender to American forces. It appears, however, that these French soldiers are none too willing to surrender to anyone. As the 6,000 Americans begin landing, French shore batteries fire on the invading troops. Soon enough, though, they are silenced when Allied warships offshore respond in kind. While the British forces begin to come ashore and join in the fray, the Americans continue to advance inland. By 8:30 a.m., French commanders along the coast are ready to negotiate a surrender. In Morocco, the Western Task Force is having the most difficult time of the 3. Unlike the other 2 groups, which traveled from English ports, the Western Task Group, operating under the command of Major General George S. Patton, sailed from the United States. Now, having survived the journey, the ocean they have just crossed seems unwilling to let them go ashore. As the landing craft move toward the beach, the turbulent sea batters them about. Many never make it. Once on land, things begin to look up. The French are totally unprepared. The city of Safi falls quickly, and soon after, Patton comes ashore. Reports filtering back to General Eisenhower at Allied Forces headquarters are by and large positive. Despite continued fighting, all three task forces have landed and are pushing toward their objectives. Perhaps more important, the combined land, sea, and air forces of the U.S. and Britain are functioning as a single, cohesive military force. Yet for all the good news, Eisenhower's gratification is diminished by the cruel realities that ultimately confront all military leaders. For along with reports of the initial successes, come reports of the first American men to sacrifice their lives in the battle against the Axis. Since America's initial landing on Guadalcanal, American commanders have discovered that the jungle-blanketed islands of the South Pacific will pose hazards and challenges for our soldiers, unlike any they have experienced before. Strategists must alter their tactics to fight in the alien landscape. Engineers must modify equipment to prevent destruction by the elements. And the men doing the actual fighting must accept the pervasive discomfort and sickness endemic to the jungle. It became clear very early on that winning the war in the Pacific would require not only special military skills, but special medical ones as well. The waterholes of the Pacific Islands carry the threat of dysentery. As a result, the medical officers preach a purifying gospel. Water purification tablets and distillation systems are shipped along with the first supplies after a beach landing. The islands are rife with disease. Typhoid, cholera, and yellow fever are among the least of the killers. By far the worst is the mosquito-spread blight malaria. The men take daily doses of atiprin and quinine to head off infection and follow standardized mosquito avoidance procedures. Medics spend hundreds of hours hunting for the stagnant pools in which mosquitoes breed. When larvae are found, they spray the surface of the water with oil, both suffocating and poisoning the pests, before calling in bulldozers to destroy the breeding ground. As troublesome as the plants and insects are, the terrain of the islands poses even more of an obstacle to providing medical treatment. Delivery of supplies presents a massive logistical problem. The crates of pills, bandages, and precious plasma come in by airdrop, truck, mule, even on the backs of GIs. Even more daunting than getting supplies to medics in the jungles is the problem of getting wounded men out. The forces on any given island are spread across miles of land impassable on anything but foot. Medics must carry their fallen comrades out of harm's way on stretchers, a hard means of travel that only compounds injuries. Upon arrival at the battalion aid station, doctors examine the wounded and pin a man's medical information to his shirt with an emergency medical tag. Those who can be helped immediately receive attention and are sent back to the line. Others are sent on for further treatment. The most desperate are handled on the spot. Surgery is performed in makeshift operating rooms. Tents and dugouts are all these hospitals can offer to protect the men from further injury and infection. Those requiring more extensive treatment go to the collecting station and, if need be, to a hospital ship. There, expert medical care is available, as well as relatively peaceful time to recuperate. Only the most seriously wounded return home. The rest, once fully recovered, will rejoin their units at the front. Watching the men return to battle, one cannot help but be struck by the irony faced by the medics and doctors. If they do their jobs well and are successful in healing their patients, They can only watch in silence as the same men they have mended are thrust back in harm's way. Despite that, they approach their jobs with all the fierce intensity of a soldier in battle. They know that without the care that only they can provide, the Allied battle for the islands of the South Pacific is as good as lost.